I think we should abolish that. All right, we're on, speaking of abolish, we're on Chapter 31. Abolitionists want to end slavery. We should know abolitionists already. We've studied some of this already.
Frederick Douglass.
Right, Frederick Douglass.
Yep. What? Yeah.
Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, right?
Uh-huh.
All right, and there's some more we're going to read about, right?
Yep.
All right, so let us read about that, okay? And of course, William Lloyd Garrison, one of the big famous ones. Abolition. Well, back in 1765, Americans had shouted the word. To abolish means to end or do away with something. Before the Revolution, it was the hated British stamp tax, and the American colonists wanted to abolish. Then the word began to use with a new meaning. It was the slave trade some wanted to abolish, and then slavery itself. In 1773, Ben Franklin wrote in a letter that a disposition to abolish slavery prevails in North America. That, in plain English, means people in North America want to find a way to end slavery. 2 years later, Franklin helped found the American Abolition Society. The official African slave trade did end when the Constitution said it would, in 1808. So that's a good thing. When they did that Constitution, they wanted no more new slaves from Africa. All right.
Yeah.
All right. But slavery continued. Yeah. Nope. And an illegal slave trade began. We've talked about this. I told you about that. They found ways to sneak in slaves. The problem was of finding workers for jobs nobody wanted. No one had anything good to say about slavery, at least not in George Washington's day. But then, slowly, some people's ideas changed. Partly it was because during the 1820s and 1830s, some slaves rebelled and killed white people. After that, white Southerners started to be afraid of the slaves. Slavery became even more cruel. New laws were passed that gave slaves almost no rights at all. Some Southerners began finding excuses for slavery. Others began to say it was a fine way of life for slave and master. Well, if you read the diaries and letters of white Southerners, you will see there are many who knew better. Robert E. Lee, who was to become the South's most famous general in the Civil War, wrote in a letter, "Slavery is a moral evil in any society, more so to the white than to the black." But some people didn't care about morality. The South was having economic problems, and some Southern political leaders began blaming the North for those problems. Virginia and South Carolina had once been very rich colonies. They'd be the envy of all the Americas. Now, the Old South was in decline. The tobacco land was worn out. Economic power, money had moved to the new cotton states and to the new industries in the North. The Southern leaders didn't seem to understand what was happening. Immigrants and ideas and inventions were changing the North. The South was left out of that excitement. Newcomers didn't want to move south. They knew that as workers they couldn't compete with slaves for jobs. The South became isolated. It didn't grow with the 19th century. Southerners began to live in a world of olden times. They read stories of the old days and believed those days were better. They wouldn't admit they were trapped in an evil system that got worse and worse each year. Rebellious religious groups got involved. In the North, the Quakers were at the center of the abolitionist movement. But the leaders of some other religions, North and South, defended slavery. Wow. The South became very jealous of political power. So did the North. Each wanted to dominate the nation. Each was afraid of the other. Tempers flared. It got more intense than that old conflict between Federalists and Republicans. But as long as Congress was divided evenly between slave states and free states, there was some stability. Then, In 1820, Missouri asked to enter the Union as a slave state. Northerners were alarmed. If Missouri became a state, the North could be outvoted in Congress. Northern congressmen were afraid of what might happen next. Suppose Congress voted to allow slavery in all the states. The situation was tense. Finally, a solution was found. Here it is. Maine was carved from the Massachusetts and made into a state, a free state. That kept the balance of free and slave states. That action was called the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise also said that the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory that was north of Missouri's southern border was to remain free. Look in the map on 161. This is complicated, but important. The Missouri Compromise kept some of the anger between North and South under control for a while. Meanwhile, in the first years of the 19th century, most European countries ended slavery. Those countries began to criticize the United States for allowing it. Some people in the North, who for a long time hadn't seemed to care about it, started speaking out against slavery. By 1840, there were said to be about 2,000 abolitionist societies in the North. Well, some Northerners and Southerners talked of gradually freeing the slaves and even paying the slave owners. The abolitionists wanted to do away with slavery at once. They didn't think anyone should be paid for owing someone else. As it turned out, it would have been much cheaper to pay the slave owners than to go to war. When the abolitionists published newspapers and books that attacked slavery, Southern postmasters wouldn't let them be delivered. Southern whites were losing their liberty. They couldn't read what they wanted. Don't think this was a case of good Northerners and bad Southerners. Many white Southerners hated slavery and treated blacks decently. And many white Northerners didn't seem to know about the golden rule, do unto others. Northern blacks were rarely given the rights of citizens. In most places they weren't allowed to vote or serve on juries. In the North, blacks often held the worst jobs, and black children were usually not allowed in white schools. Many white Northerners hated the abolitionists. Some Northern industries depended on Southern business. Because of that, some Northerners didn't want to upset the South. Other Northerners were just afraid of change. And what the abolitionists were demanding was a major change in the United States. Unfortunately, there are always people who fear new ideas. In the North, abolitionist presses were burned and destroyed, and one abolitionist was actually murdered. In the South, the abolitionists were really hated. When Northerners talked about abolishing slavery, it made white Southerners furious. They were the ones whose lives would be changed. They didn't think it was the Yankees' business, and they said so. They didn't want to hear criticism of their beloved South. They didn't want to be told they were doing something immoral. Many white Southerners believed their liberty and property were being threatened by outsiders. They didn't worry about black liberty or property. You can see this is an argument that was heating up. The abolitionists wrote and printed newspapers and books. Former slaves began to speak out and tell their stories. The abolitionists got angrier and angrier. Some abolitionists were so outraged by slavery, they suggested that New England secede from the Union. That means they wanted to separate themselves from the other states. They wanted to form their own country. Some people in the South began saying the same thing. They wanted to secede and form their own country. These people were serious. No good would come of this. There's a picture of Frederick Douglass. We've already read a whole book on Frederick, so big hero of mine. All right. Well, hope you're having a good week, and we'll see you later. Bye.